Hello, my name is Laura Kane. I am an assistant professor at Worcester State University starting in fall 2020. I'm currently finishing a term as an assistant professor at the University of Tampa, and this is my presentation for the 12th Biennial Collective Intentionality Conference. In a 2013 New York Times article, Nick Bilton wrote, "The immediacy and fast pace of the internet can be magical. But when someone makes a comment that the masses disagree with, a mob with 140-character pitchforks can develop in seconds, and the internet can become terrifyingly bellicose." The comment he was referring to was made by Justine Sacco, the now infamous former communications director for Interactive Corp., who tweeted, "Going to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS, just kidding, I'm white," just before boarding an 11-hour flight to Cape Town. Sacco meant for her tweet to be interpreted sarcastically, and thinking nothing of it, she turned off her phone for the duration of her flight. Upon landing, she turned her phone on and discovered that her world was suddenly in shambles. Her tweet had been shared thousands of times, prompting an onslaught of public shaming and calls for termination, which in turn led to her employer publicly terminating her from her job. And for a taste of what some of Justine endured after making this tweet, here is a couple of video clips from John Ronson's TED Talk, When Online Shaming Goes Too Far.
First, there were the philanthropists. Then came the beyond horrified. It started to get darker. Then came the calls for her to be fired. Thousands of people around the world decided it was their duty to get her fired. Corporations got involved, hoping to sell their products on the back of Justine's annihilation. And then came the trolls. Somebody else that night wrote, "Somebody HIV positive should rape this bitch, and then we'll find out if her skin colour protects her from AIDS." And that person got a free pass. Nobody went after that person. We're also excited about destroying Justine, and our shaming brains are so simple-minded that we couldn't also handle destroying somebody who was inappropriately destroying Justine. Justine was really uniting a lot of disparate groups that night, from philanthropists to rape the bitch.
And it's not just Ronson who has discussed what happened to Justine Sacco or to others who have been publicly shamed as well. Many articles, op-eds, in addition to books, have talked about internet mobs, labeling them internet mobs, and talking about them as though they're some kind of collective, as something familiar, as something well-defined. And worse, social media users at large ground this assumption when they treat internet mobs as somehow righteous in discourse about what these transgressors deserve. And when we hear this term internet mob, what do we think of? Is it some well-defined kind of social group instantiated by some set of members at any particular time? Is it the community at large becoming animated by a particular issue? What exactly is an internet mob? Is it indeed a well-defined social group? That is what my talk is going to be about. I contend that internet mobs form something closer to what Iris Marion Young calls a serial collective. In a 1994 paper, Young reconceptualized Sartre's account of seriality in his critique of dialectical reason in an effort to solve an important dilemma in feminist theory. There's nothing specific to feminist politics without some sense in which women is the name of some social collective, yet at the same time any effort to identify the attribute or attributes that would make up such a collective appears to undermine feminist politics by leaving out some women that ought to be included. And so to solve this dilemma, Young argues that gender ought to refer to a social series, which is a specific kind of social collectivity that Sartre distinguishes from groups. A group, according to Sartre, is a collection of persons who recognizes themselves and one another as in a unified relation with one another. Members of a group mutually acknowledge that together they undertake a common project. In this sense, members of a group are united by actions that they undertake together, as collectively oriented toward the same goal as one another, and they mutually acknowledge this goal and that they can only work toward this goal together. As Sartre understands it, groups arise from and often fall back into a less organized and unself-conscious collective unity. And this is what he refers to as a series. Unlike a group, which forms around actively shared objectives, a series is a social collective whose members are unified passively by the objects around which their actions are oriented, or by the objectified results of the material effects of the actions of others. So there's a loosely structured social unity in a series, but it's derived from the way in which individuals pursue their own individual ends with respect to what Sartre calls the same milieu. The milieu is an already given, already constituted background set of material things. It's the background set of material things, affordances and constraints, and collectivized habits against which any particular action occurs. The milieu is the conscious and continuous material environment that structures and is structured by the unintended collective results of past actions. Sartre describes people waiting for a bus as an example of a series. The people waiting for the bus are collective insofar as they minimally relate to one another and follow the rules of bus waiting. For example, standing in line from the first arrived to the last arrived, or not occupying 2 or more seats with personal items, and so on and so forth. As a collective, they are brought together by their relation to a material object, the bus, as well as the social practices of public transportation. So this is the milieu. Their actions and goals may differ, and they may have no common histories, experiences, or identities. They are loosely united only by their desire to ride on that particular bus route at that particular time. Although in this way they are a social collective, they don't identify with one another, they don't affirm themselves as engaged in some sort of shared enterprise, or identify themselves with common experiences. And in this sense, serialities are unstable and subject to dissolution. For instance, once the people board the bus, they're no longer a loose collective of individuals waiting for the bus. Serialities are transitory social liaisons which lack the influence of a common object or a common idea. And although a seriality tends towards dissolution, much like the people who get on the bus, it can be the primitive basis of a cohesive social unit if each individual becomes aware of the potentiality implicit in seriality. The initial unifying force which could generate group formation is interest, a common concern or a common interest that brings about collective activity on the part of the members of this loosely structured collective. For instance, the potential of the series to organize itself becomes manifest if the bus fails to come. The people who are waiting for the bus will complain. They'll begin to complain to one another about the lousy bus service. They will share horror stories of lateness and of breakdowns that they've incurred in the past. Perhaps they'll assign one of them to go call the company, or they'll begin collecting money to share a taxi together. Because each individual is aware of the serialized content of their activity in a social collective whose structure constitutes them within certain limits and constraints, they are also in a position to transform this loosely unified structure into something more intentional, what Sartre calls a group infusion. A group infusion begins to form when the serialized individuals, for instance in our bus example, recognize a common threat or a common danger or a common goal, that their bus is late and that they have places to be, and begin to unify themselves around a common praxis, pooling together money for a taxi, calling to complain, so on and so forth. The self-conscious recognition on the part of the individual members of this group Infusion, of the common purpose of this group, lead each member to synthesize the group as a totality, and it also enables the group members to alienate those who do not share this inner orientation. At this point, it might be tempting to think about an internet mob as a group Infusion. After all, participants all seemingly share a common concern and a common goal. For instance, in the Sacco case, participants shared initial disgust, an initial rejection of Sacco's comments, and a desire to let such sentiments be known. We might argue that the participants fed off one another in a contagious reaction that led to more and more tweets from an increasing number of individuals, corporations, and trolls. We might even argue that this contagion led to the formation of a shared group goal, Sacco's employment termination, which is certainly how Ronson portrays it. However, I think this is the wrong way to conceptualize internet mobs. I suggest that internet mobs never materialize beyond serial collectives. And further, I'll suggest momentarily that when we conflate internet mobs with groups Infusion, we give the idea of the mob outsized power, which gives others the opportunity for manipulation, those who would use this power, the idea of such a powerful mob, to produce even more harmful ends. So what makes an internet mob a serial collective and not a group Infusion? Perhaps a better example to use is Sartre's radio listeners, another example that Jung discusses. The collective of radio listeners is constituted by their individual orientation toward radios, which is their object, and their material possibilities and transmissions, the affordances and constraints that this particular milieu provides. As listeners, they're isolated, but nevertheless, they're aware of being part of a series of radio listeners, of others listening simultaneously, linked to them indirectly through broadcasting. One's experience of radio listening is partly conditioned by this awareness of being linked to others that one is separated from, and also one's awareness of being the other for these separated individuals as well, one's recognition that to others they are themselves an other. But if, for instance, the radio broadcast suddenly became unavailable, or the broadcaster uttered something problematic, in the vein of Sacco's tweet, what action would radio listeners have available to them? Perhaps they might individually call the broadcaster to complain, or write to the local paper to air their grievances about the problematic utterance. The initial flurry of calls or printed complaints might spur additional calls and letters, giving the appearance of a coordinated effort to shame the broadcaster or to bring about a particular outcome, such as the termination of some radio personality or some transmission company. Yet the radio listeners never intentionally band together. They never come together around a common goal with the express intention of collectively bringing it about. Rather, they all individually pursue one end or another through individual actions that are nonetheless similar and that together bring about some effect, but they don't intentionally, collectively bring about that effect. The radio listeners, just as the participants in an internet mob, are constrained by the milieu. In both cases, the technological objects that connect individuals together in their separateness, such that individual activities take on the feeling of group connectivity, yet actually consist in no more unity than what a serial collective is. Members of the series experience themselves as powerless to alter this material milieu, and they understand that the others in the series are equally constrained. Members of the series are each affected by the milieu, such that their actions are structured by its constraints. Yet the milieu also offers affordances that give members the ability to structure the milieu as well. And we can think about this as the contagion that produces more activity. In the case of the internet mob, the internet and social networking sites such as Twitter constrain the activities of the individual members of the series. For instance, by limiting the format of communication through the algorithm that determines what's popular or trending, or by one stable connection to the internet. Yet this milieu also offers affordances, a nearly instantaneous means for communicating with an unlimited number of others, the ability to respond and react quickly to changing communication environment, and the ability to see one's own comments reflected in the comments of others. Yet at the same time, each member of the serial collective acts for their own purpose, on their own motives, and with their own individual goal. Participants each act for their own purpose, perhaps through anger, frustration, resentment, excitement at what's happening, but they're unaware of how their act will be perceived by others, how their act will fall in line with the acts of others, how together many of these individual acts constitute something larger and more powerful than any one individual act alone. Their particular contribution is not itself special, but their contributions together, individually motivated, are essential for achieving their individual purposes, to shame, to call attention to problematize. In order to be effective, each participant must expect of others that they'll also participate, and that there is an infrastructure in place to amplify their voices. In this sense, they anticipate that there is a precedent for such activities to be taken seriously and to produce results. This precedent that enables participants to feel as though they're a part of something is akin to what Catherine Ritchie identifies as an unintentionally created social structure. Ritchie argues that a social structure is unintentionally created if no people, individually or collectively, intend to create it, which is in contrast to an intentionally created social structure, such as a sports team or the branches of government. A structure is intentionally instantiated when some people intend to instantiate it, perhaps by intending to play certain roles. Otherwise, a structure is unintentionally instantiated. Internet mobs are unintentionally created and unintentionally instantiated. They arise as serial collectives, never transitioning into groups and fusion. Yet internet mobs do tend to follow a particular format. That is, they have a recognizable social structure, even if they are not group-like. Because they have a recognizable social structure, internet mobs may be exploited by some individuals who, acting individually or in a pre-existing group, seek to use the power of such collectives to produce harmful ends intentionally. And here I'm referencing the intentional manipulation of a series to produce a particular intended effect, which a series qua series cannot produce in its own collective individualism. We might identify these individual manipulative actors as trolls, or in more coordinated cases, as organizations such as the Internet Research Agency, which is a Kremlin-backed troll group. Such individual actors or organizations exploit the seemingly group-like appearance of an internet mob to bring attention to a particular cause, such as getting fake news circulated quickly, or to sow division. In such cases, an internet mob still does not rise to the level of a group infusion, but the milieu has been manipulated such that the individual actions of participants are affected by the introduction of an object, in this case, the new or inflammatory information circulating, in a familiar environment, which is the social networking site. It's problematic to conflate serial collectives with moral communities because of the outsized power it gives such collectives to bring about particular outcomes, especially those that cause significant emotional and financial distress to the targets of shame. Moreover, for those individuals whose aim it is to bring about dialogue about moral norms, either through shame or through calling for philanthropic actions or calling to bring attention to something in light of someone's offensive tweet or action, the participation of those individuals and their individual goals is constrained by the format and the action of others who are also piling on, so that even if they have a sincere interest in trying to engage with the transgressor, they cannot because their own voice is drowned out by others, and they appear to be, which meaning they are serialized as a mob participant and not an interlocutor. And this limits and constrains how effective dialogue about something like moral norms can be. This is a sketch of an interpretive framework for understanding the force and vulnerabilities of internet mobs. My hope is that this framework will serve as a means for establishing practices to counter especially exploitative mob activities. We've all heard the term "don't feed the trolls," but what could we do that could be more effective? We could give less clout to internet mobs by identifying them not as cohesive wholes, but as collections of individuals with myriad individual goals and purposes. Doing so might weaken the amount of damage an internet mob can do to an individual or to a population of individuals whose activities are guided less by group thinking and more by the structure of the social milieu that determines what kinds of collective activities are possible. Thanks.